So, couple disclaimers before we get started. We're going to cover chapter 1, but we are only going to cover a couple of the concepts. It's really important that you read the entire chapter and that you study the textbook. I'm just going to go over a few of the concepts. So let's get started with chapter 1. So let's start with a basic definition. What is abnormal psychology? Well, it is a division of psychology, and we study people who are abnormal. And you'll learn that I believe that we all have some traits, although we're going to talk specifically about how we diagnose disorders. And we're going to talk about what is considered atypical or what would worthy a diagnosis in our society. And that's what we're going to spend the rest of this lecture talking about. So, to make a diagnosis in this society, one way of looking at it is something that we call the 4 Ds. And that is what we're going to spend the rest of this time talking about. So what the 4 Ds are there are 4 words that we use, and we use those to see if somebody meets criteria, or in other words, whether or not the symptoms that they have meet what we would consider a level or a threshold in order to make a diagnosis. Because we've all experienced sadness. We've all had anxiety. Does that mean that we've all had depression? Does that mean that we've all had anxiety? Well, probably not, at least not to the point that we would get the diagnosis. So how do you make that determination? How do you know if that's abnormal? So that's what we're going to talk about right now. And we're going to talk about one way of looking at it and one way of making that determination. How do you get to that threshold? How do you know if you're sad, is that abnormal? So let's talk about that now. So the first of those 4 Ds, those 4 words that start with D, is discomfort. And that has to do with physical or psychological comfort. And we would consider that like personal pain as a result of the disorder. So if if somebody has a disorder and the disorder is causing them, like just, it hurts them. A really good example of this, and one that I see sometimes with people, is depression. So let's say that you have, and just for example, let's say that you have a mother, and she is able to do all her roles. So she's a mother, she's a wife, she's going to work, she's doing everything that she needs to do. But she is so tearful and sad all the time. So she is baking the cookies, but she is like just dying inside. She is taking the kids off to kindergarten or doing whatever, but she is just sad all the time. Well, if she were to come in and to talk with me, and if we were to talk about it, and over a period of time, and if as she's describing it, if her own description of what she's experiencing, if she was describing something that was she was personally experiencing a lot of discomfort, then that might be one clue that she's meeting the threshold of having a disorder. It doesn't guarantee it, but that might be one clue. So the first of the 4 Ds is discomfort. Is the person having personal discomfort from having this disorder? And I mention that because not all of the disorders bother the person who has them. There will be disorders, and we'll talk about this later on in the class, that the person's perfectly comfortable having the disorder. They don't mind that they have that disorder, or they don't even know that they have that disorder. But in some of the disorders, the person can do everything that they need to do, but it personally is very hard and painful for them. So the first one of the 4 Ds is discomfort. The second D is deviance, and this has to do with bizarre or unusual behavior. So people, and this is such an important thing, if there's one thing I want you to leave this class knowing, one thing, and here I am telling you within the first 10 minutes, but people are allowed to be weird. People are allowed to do things that you wouldn't do. People are allowed to do things that are just really bizarre. And that doesn't mean that they are mentally ill. It doesn't mean that they have a disorder. So people are allowed to be just weird. I can think of a million examples, and now with the internet and how we see things on TV, you will see examples every single day. I mean, you could just walk down the street and you'll see examples. But when I'm talking deviance, I'm talking about weird behavior that is not accepted by society. For example, pedophilia. So having tattoos all over your face is kind of weird, but that's not going to put you in jail. Pedophilia will. So when I'm talking about the second D, deviance, what I'm talking about is deviant behavior that is illegal or that is considered completely unacceptable by society, and that by doing that behavior, that puts you into the abnormal behavior realm. So an example of this would be a man who becomes sexually aroused by flashing preteen girls. He might not be at all upset about his behavior. So remember the slide before, I told you not everyone's upset about their abnormal behavior. He might be happy about it, or not happy, but he's okay with his behavior. He could be. There are people that do abnormal behaviors that are fine with doing it. He's probably more worried about getting caught than about his abnormal behavior, but that behavior would be considered deviant. So that is the second D, deviant. So he could be a husband, he could be a father, he could be a co-worker, he could be doing all the things within society, but that behavior is considered deviant. So when we're looking at abnormal behavior, we're going through the D's. So does it cause the person distress? Well, in that case, no, it doesn't cause him distress. Is that behavior deviant? Yes, that is deviant. It is deviant to flash anyone. So yes, that would be considered abnormal. Okay, the third one is dysfunctional. And dysfunctional has to do with if that behavior or if it causes impairment or an inability to perform one's normal roles. So remember in the first example, the woman, she was able to do all of her roles. So she was able to take the kids to school, and she was able to go to work, and she was able to do everything. So it wasn't impairing her roles. Well, with dysfunction, it's getting in the way of doing your roles. So there's something that's going on that you can't do your normal roles in life. For example, if you have a phobia of bridges, and we're actually going to talk a lot about this down when we get to phobias, but if you have a true phobia, it would cause dysfunction in your life. And a lot of people say they have a phobia, but they don't actually have one. To have a real phobia, it has to cause some sort of dysfunction. It has to get in the way of your life. So it can't be that you don't like bridges, or it can't be that you would rather go around a bridge. It has to be that it has caused some sort of dysfunction in your life. So you have a job, your dream job is on the other side of that bridge, and you can't get to it. So it has caused dysfunction in your life. Or let's say you have a phobia of snakes, and you cannot go to, actually I have a better example. I know I treated a client once who could not go to the zoo on a date because she knew there was a reptile house at the zoo, and she was afraid that she would get close to, what if a snake escaped from the tank and then escaped from the reptile house and then got out into the zoo? So she wanted to go on this date with the person, but had like that illogical fear. So do you see how this is causing a dysfunction within her life? It's beyond just being afraid of a snake. It's bigger than that. So that is causing dysfunction in the person's life. So that's the third D. And then the fourth one is dangerousness. And this one has to do with the importance of trying to predict if a client or if a person is considered dangerous to themselves or others. And the one thing I do want to mention about this, it is really, really difficult to predict with accuracy if someone is dangerous, especially with like suicide attempts. So the biggest predictor, if somebody is suicidal, if they're going to commit suicide, is whether or not they've attempted before. But as a whole, we're not very good at predicting whether or not somebody is going to predict suicide today. And it's very difficult because there's a lot of different factors that go into it. But we do consider that one of the four, D's, and that does go in if somebody's dangerous. And that can also, not just with suicidality, but also harm to others. So those are the 4 D's, and it's one way of looking at abnormal behavior. And I'm going to show you how we apply this now. Okay, so let's apply this. So one of the disorders that we're going to talk about down the road is body dysmorphia. And this, by the way, is an actual person. Body dysmorphia is when a person believes that they have a flaw when they don't. And then often what happens is they will frequently have multiple surgeries to attempt to correct this perceived flaw. So, for example, if I had body dysmorphia and I felt like my nose was misshapen, I might have multiple surgeries to correct my nose, or I might obsess about it and think that you were constantly looking at, and now you're all looking at my nose. But often now what we will see is people having multiple surgeries to correct some flaw, and the person truly believes that there is something wrong. Now, some of you are thinking, that sounds a lot like anorexia, and you're right, it is a cousin, and we will talk about that. And how, because people with anorexia also have misperceptions about their bodies. So if you were making that connection, you were on the right path. But you need to know what body dysmorphia is we're going to apply the 4 Ds now. But I needed you to know what this disorder was. So here, follow me now. Okay, so my friend Heather. Now, here's a picture of my daughter. This is 10 years ago. My goodness, she's a teenager now. And my friend Heather. Okay. My friend Heather, true story, she thinks her toes are too long. I'm not, the true story. When I look at her feet, her toes might be a little bit long, but they look normal to me. But Heather refuses to wear sandals. So if we go to the beach, she wears some kind of closed shoe. She doesn't wear sandals. Okay. So no matter what, if we go canoeing, we go anything, she doesn't show her toes. So here's the question. Does Heather have body dysmorphia? Here's the evidence. Her toes appear to be normal. She does not think her toes look normal, and she refuses to show her toes in public, even on a hot summer day. So we're going to apply the 4 Ds and see if she meets criteria. And this is how, this is just beginning to apply, so let's see how we would do this. Okay, so just think for a second. First question, and there's going to be a test question on this. So first thing, write down the 4 Ds in your notes. Like, just get the 4 Ds ready, because what I'm going to want you to be able to do is write down the 4 Ds and then explain why or why not they would not meet criteria for each of the 4 Ds. Okay, I'm going to walk you through this one, so it'll be easy then when you get to the, when I say test, but it'll be easy for you to do this. I'm just showing, I'm going to walk you through this one. So first thing, think of the 4 Ds. So, questions to think in your head. Is it deviant to not wear sandals? Does it cause her distress? Is it dysfunctional? Is she dangerous? So just think those questions in your head. Okay, so first thing, is it deviant not to wear sandals? So remember, deviant. This one's kind of easy because if you remember deviant, the example I gave you was the flasher. So deviant had to do with go to jail. It had to do with things that were society would have a problem with. So society really doesn't care so much if you wear sandals. I mean, personally, you would catch me dead in spandex. We all make fashion decisions. And society, you're not going to get arrested for making those fashion decisions, even if, you know what, even if I did wear spandex, I wouldn't get arrested. So if Heather wears sandals or doesn't wear sandals, society is not going to do anything. There is no law against it. So we could just cross off deviance. So that one you could answer, I mean, with body dysmorphia, she's not deviant. So that one was easy. Okay, the next one, does it cause her personal distress? Now here, and this is a very important point, very important, so listen for a second. And this is where students have a hard time in this class sometimes. Do not read into anything. I didn't tell you that Heather was like having a massive meltdown over it. I didn't say that she was, you know, absolutely devastated or that she had lost her job or that I didn't give you any information to indicate that she was falling apart. People are allowed to be unhappy. I am not happy that I wish that I was slightly smaller, but that doesn't mean that I'm in personal distress and falling apart over it. So here's the mistake that some students make in this class. When they hear that, because I'm going to give you case studies, and when they hear that one of the case studies is unhappy about something, I think you're going to be very eager to jump in and think that they're depressed or that they're having a problem or that their life's falling apart. I will tell you that they are not getting out of bed and that they are crying every day. I will give it to you if they are depressed. I will give it to you very clearly. If I say that they don't like something, assume that they don't like it, but you know what? We all don't like something. Okay, so don't ever read in any further than what I give it to you as. So in this case, I said she doesn't like her toes, she doesn't like the way they look. I challenge any of you to find somebody that likes everything about the way they look. I mean, just think about our society. So, does it cause her personal distress? I didn't give you anything about that she's going to a therapist over it or that she has lost sleep or that she's struggling. So, I would argue that in this case, that it's not really causing her personal distress. Heather's a really happy person and she has a full life. She doesn't like the way her toes look. I mean, I wish my fingernails were longer. It doesn't mean that she's depressed or that she has body dysmorphia over her toes. Okay? So be very, very careful about it. And on an exam or on a test, if you explain the way you're thinking, I will be able to give you credit. So I don't want you getting so nervous about answering questions, but just be careful not to read into anything too much. So let me just read through this. Sometimes students argue that she's uncomfortable, so she must be in distress, but just keep in mind that for a person to be in distress, it has to cause impairment. They have to be to the point that they're just really, really uncomfortable, and there wasn't evidence of that. So very, very important point. Okay, so is it dysfunctional? Has her dislike of her toes caused her to not to fulfill one of her roles, to be a mother, a friend, an employee, to not be able to get a job? Has it caused some sort of dysfunction in her life? And fortunately, there's no rules that you have to wear sandals. And there's nothing in the story that I gave you that said that it has caused impairment. There hasn't been any impairment. I mean, she lives a fine life without wearing open-toed shoes. In fact, she has nicer shoes than I do. So, you know, all is good. So, do you see how I applied each of the 4 Ds? And I would come to the conclusion then that she does not meet criteria for body dysmorphia because she did not meet any of those 4 Ds. Now, there's a whole lot more that goes into it, and I don't want you guys like jumping in and we're not making diagnoses in this class. I just want you to get the flavor and the idea of how we go about doing the things. And the other thing that is just so important is to realize that you're going to see a lot of symptoms in this class, but just because you see symptoms doesn't mean that you or somebody that you know has that disorder. And that's another really, really, really important point that I want you to leave this class knowing. So you're going to read a lot of, you're going to hear things, and it's so easy to think, oh yeah, no, I have that, I have that, I have that. And I've had students after they've left this class say, oh my goodness, I thought after every chapter I experienced some of that. And we're human, and I hope that you have experienced some of the symptoms, but that doesn't mean that you ever experience it to the threshold that would have gotten you that diagnosis. So the bottom line, and you guys might not even know who some of these people are, but I tried to pick a group of people, but people are allowed to be weird. Just leave this class saying people are allowed to be weird. People are allowed to be weird. They're allowed to be different, but that doesn't mean that they get a diagnosis. So Heather would not meet criteria for mental illness. To meet criteria, the symptoms would have to cause significant problems and would have to meet certain criteria. I don't expect you to know what that criteria is right now. We're going to start covering them. In each of these chapters, we're going to talk about different disorders, and we're going to talk about what criteria the person would have in order to meet, or to need to meet in order to have that disorder. I will give you different vignettes, and sometimes in those vignettes, the person won't have a disorder. And that is real life. People come in to see me, and sometimes they don't have a disorder. That happens. The other thing that I want to mention just really quickly is be cautious to not overdiagnose. And you're going to hear me say this a whole bunch during this class, but I think something that students want to do is they want to start, if they see, sad and anxious, and they want to start like diagnosing everything. And it's really quite rare that somebody has what I call a shopping list of disorders. And I will not be giving you in these vignettes, like you won't have a scenario where somebody has 12 different disorders. I'm going to keep it simple. So don't start over analyzing everything. We're going to keep it simple. Sometimes there won't be any, sometimes there won't be anything because the person will just have, they'll be within normal human experiences. And you'll be able to explain why using those 4 Ds. So that's why this is a very important lecture to understand how we apply those. So like I said, one of the things I want you to take from this course is that not all strange behavior is indicative of some sort of mental disorder. And of course, don't read into it and think that you have mental disorders. No. You will read about them, you will see the symptoms, and it's very easy to think, oh yeah, that's me, that's me, that's me. So in addition to the 4Ds, there are other ways to look at abnormal behavior. I mean, that is not the only way. That's one of the ways I like because I think it drills home the idea that we have to look at multiple layers. But we also need to take a look at the social and the cultural context. So for example, if I am diagnosing somebody from a culture that I am not familiar with, it would be negligent of me to not familiarize myself with that culture, because there may be things that I do not know, or things that I might assume that are normal or abnormal, but it could be cultural related. Some other things I just want to mention is there are some diagnoses that we use statistical analysis with. For example, when we look at cognitive impairment, we take a look at statistical analysis. For example, with IQ, if we take an IQ of 70, below that, we will say there's cognitive impairment. We also take a look at deviation from ideal mental health. We take a look at multicultural perspectives. So there's a lot of different ways of looking at abnormal behavior, not just the one that I spent a lot of time talking about. So please do read your textbook. A few other things that I want to talk about. How common are mental disorders? Prevalence. Give you a quick definition here. Prevalence has to do with the percentage of people in a population with a disorder at a given time. And I do want you to have a general sense of how prevalent certain disorders are. For example, some disorders are more prevalent than others, more common than others. Lifetime prevalence. That would be the total proportion of people in a population who have ever had that disorder. So that means that over their lifetime, have people had this disorder? And then we also have incidence, the onset or occurrence of a disorder over a period of time. Some disorders are fairly common, and it's likely that you know somebody, yourself or somebody else, who has met criteria for these. For example, depression, anxiety, and addictions. They are the most common, and that's something that you should leave this class knowing. So depression, anxiety, and addictions. Very, very common. Some less common, for example, would be schizophrenia. Bipolar disorder, less common, although bipolar disorder is becoming more common, but it is certainly less common than depression. So most common, depression, anxiety, depression, anxiety, and addictions. Okay, so wrapping things up, just want to again warn you about the medical student syndrome. And that is, as we hear about all these disorders, thinking, oh, I've been depressed and anxious and indecisive and paranoid and thinking that you have all these disorders. And I know that there's some of you who are watching this and you won't be doing that, but there are some who will, so don't. So just resist the temptation to diagnose yourself and others around you. Your family and friends will appreciate it. Keep in mind the 4 Ds. And please let me know if you have any questions. Be sure to read your textbook, understand all the concepts in this presentation, and I would like to welcome you to the class.